everybody. Tonight, we shall begin a curious and meandering journey. One paved not with triumphs or discoveries, but with strange contraptions, forgotten follies, and well-meaning errors buried deep in the folds of time. Our tale will unfold gently across the twilight of the medieval world, where minds bright with wonder sometimes wandered too far from reason. These are the worst inventions of medieval times. Not with scorn or mockery shall we recount them, but with a tender, almost whimsical curiosity, as one might observe a long-lost puzzle or an odd trinket in a dusty chest. Let us dim the lamps of modern wisdom for a while and step back into the dim-lit halls of crumbling castles and moss-covered abbeys. Let us listen to the clank of metal on cobblestone, the whispers of candlelight on vellum, and the awkward sputter of machines born too soon. In this first part of our tale, we begin not in grandeur or in glory, but with a simple, peculiar invention, one that promised leisure but delivered only lament. The year was 1261, and the air in the small town of Saumur was heavy with the scent of late summer, hay drying in the fields, wood smoke curling from chimney pots, and the last of the cider apples ripening under a watchful sky. In a corner of the abbey's workshop, nestled between a half-finished sundial and a creaking wooden press, an elderly monk named Brother Theobald fussed over his newest creation. He was a man of gentle heart and scattered thoughts, with ink-stained fingers and the kind of spectacles that slid perpetually down the bridge of his nose. Brother Theobald believed, most sincerely, that idleness was a sin, and so he devoted himself to finding new ways to make daily labor more efficient. His latest invention, the pedal-powered reading wheel, was a grand contraption indeed, a sort of wooden carousel, fitted with scrolls and bound manuscripts that rotated with the steady work of a pair of foot pedals. The reader, seated atop a rickety stool, could turn the wheel with their legs while flipping through texts without having to rise or move about. It was, he explained to the abbot, a scholarly revolution. The monks gathered in silent curiosity as he presented it. They admired the craftsmanship, the polished oak frame, the careful alignment of pegs and spokes. Even the abbot leaned in, eyes narrowed, and murmured something about remarkable ingenuity. There was a kind of delicate excitement in the air, as if something momentous might unfold. But when Brother Lucien attempted to use it during his evening studies, the troubles began. For one, the mechanism squeaked terribly. The effort of pedaling set the entire structure rattling like a misaligned cartwheel, and each turn jostled the manuscripts so they had to be realigned constantly. The rhythmic clatter of wooden gears, meant to evoke harmony and pace, instead sounded like a blacksmith's forge in miniature. Worse yet, it made the reader motion sick. Poor Lucien, after just 15 minutes, turned pale and took to bed with a splitting headache. Brother Bernard tried next and ended up with bruised knees and a cracked page of Psalms. The stool wobbled, the pedals stuck, and at one point, the wheel spun so quickly it scattered parchment like startled birds. They tried lubricating the spokes with goose fat. They tried fixing the pedals in place with iron pins. They even tried, in desperation, chanting a prayer of mechanical blessing in the scriptorium. The reading wheel was eventually wheeled into a corner of the library and used as a coat rack. No one ever told Brother Theobald outright, but he must have known. Still, he continued to sketch improvements, dreaming of a day when monks could read without rising, without reaching, and entirely without practicality. His notes, preserved in a brittle folio, reveal an endearing optimism, scribbled margins filled with drawings of double-tiered wheels, reclining benches, and one version that included a cup holder for soup. This first tale is not so much about failure as it is about yearning, a desire to marry movement and intellect in a time when both were hard-won. And therein lies the soul of many medieval inventions, both brilliant and bizarre. For in a world dimly lit by candlelight and cloistered custom, invention often walked a crooked path. One of the strangest things about such inventions is how earnestly they were made. They weren't jokes, not at all. They were answers to questions no one else had thought to ask. And perhaps that is why they hold such charm even in their failure, because they were born not of vanity but of wonder. It is easy to laugh, but it is better to marvel. In the months after the reading wheel's quiet retirement, Brother Theobald turned his attention to another problem. the sluggish pace of monastery correspondence. His next creation, which we shall speak of another night, involved pulleys, trained ravens, and a rather unfortunate incident with the bishop's laundry. But his reading wheel would be his most beloved failure, a symbol not of shame, but of boundless curiosity. So let us not forget that in the quiet hum of that ancient abbey workshop, something beautiful stirred, even if it was entirely unworkable. There, in the gentle creak of timber and the hopeful scratch of quill against parchment, we find the echo of a mind unwilling to rest, and a heart still thrilled by the possibility of something new. Now the shadows stretch long across the stone floors, and the candles burn lower. Outside, the wind rustles gently through the orchard trees, and the last bell of Compline has sounded across the fields. Brother Theobald is asleep at his workbench, a scroll unrolled beside him, and dreams of turning wheels that never quite align. Sleep now, dear listener. The candle flickers low, and tomorrow we shall wind the thread of another odd tale just as gently. There are stories that drift softly through the ages, whispered between the stone walls of forgotten cloisters and the shadowed recesses of ancient workshops. Some are tales of quiet triumph, others of tender loss. And then there are stories like the one we now unfold, woven from the threads of high ambition, unfortunate miscalculations, and the ever-gentle folly of human invention. After the brief and bruising life of the pedal-powered reading wheel, Brother Theobald did not rest. A mind like his, curious, feverish, ever-turning, could not remain idle, even in the face of gentle ridicule. Though the wheel had stuttered and failed, his spirit had not. In the long hours of the monastic morning, while the other brothers tended to gardens or copied scripture, he sat beside the workshop's narrow window, staring at the movements of swallows in flight. They darted between the orchard branches with elegance, banking on invisible winds, landing with pinpoint precision. It was then that inspiration struck, light as a feather, sharp as a quill's tip. Why should the abbey's correspondence be so slow? Why should messengers, old and wheezing, stumble over bramble-strewn paths to carry letters to nearby monasteries? Why, indeed, when birds could fly it in half the time? Thus began the era of the monastic message raven. At first, it was only an idea. He sketched tirelessly, avian silhouettes beside diagrams of leather scroll tubes, wingspan calculations in the margins of psalms. He spoke to Brother Guillaume, the falconer, who raised his eyebrows in a skeptical arch, but lent 3 young ravens from the muse nonetheless. The birds, named Claudette, Rosamond, and Old Pete, were sturdy creatures, clever, with black eyes that watched every movement with unnerving intensity. Training them, however, was an ordeal of nearly mythical complexity. Brother Theobald read what little there was on the training of birds for message carrying, mostly Arab treatises passed along through forgotten trade routes and Latin mistranslations. He built perches lined with crumbs of oat cake, fashioned leather harnesses that the birds violently rejected, and walked daily from abbey to outpost with tiny scrolls tied to his belt, hoping the ravens would learn the path through familiarity. Weeks passed. The ravens flew, yes, but not always in the right direction. Claudette had a fondness for the town market, where she was often seen hopping among fish barrels. Rosamond disappeared for 2 full days and returned smelling suspiciously of hearth smoke and roasted chestnuts. Old Pete, the most reliable, tended to circle the abbey for a full hour before finally grudgingly delivering his scroll to a window ledge. Despite all this, Brother Theobald pressed on. He constructed small receiving boxes on the abbey's rooftop, filled them with grain and straw, and even enlisted the help of Brother Dennis, who had once worked as a postmaster's apprentice in Rouen. Together they managed to train the birds, imperfectly, but with a certain rustic consistency. The first real test was meant to be a triumph. A letter, written in Theobald's own hand, addressed to the prior of Saint-Lazare Abbey 2 miles away, was tucked neatly into a rolled strip of calfskin and secured beneath Old Pete's wing. With the entire brotherhood watching, the bird was loosed from the courtyard with a solemn blessing and a hopeful cheer. It flew straight into the laundry line. Chaos ensued. Wet habits and sheets flew in every direction. Brother Benoit, hanging linens at the far end of the yard, shouted in alarm as Old Pete emerged from the tangled cloth with a furious screech and took off again, this time eastward, toward the river. The letter was later found inside a fishing boat, miraculously intact, and handed over by a bewildered villager who'd read only the words, "May the Lord keep you in gentle service." He assumed it was a benediction and tied it to the mast for luck. That evening, Brother Theobald did not dine with the others. He remained in the workshop, quietly polishing the raven's harness and scribbling new notes by candlelight. He did not speak of the failure, but those who passed him noted the faraway look in his eyes, a man already lost in the next invention. In the weeks that followed, he attempted further improvements. He designed miniature helmets for the birds, though they refused to wear them. He experimented with lighter scrolls, thinner parchment, more balanced payloads. He even constructed a small training tower from which ravens could be launched like arrows, but Rosamond quickly took to roosting in it and refused to leave. Eventually, the experiment was retired, not with any formal decree, but with a kind of gentle fading. The ravens were returned to Brother Guillaume's care, where they lived long and peaceful lives, occasionally pecking at abandoned manuscripts. The rooftop boxes remained for years afterward, rotting quietly beneath layers of moss and bird droppings. And yet the story lingered. Novices whispered of the flying letters of Saumur. Travelers from distant parishes asked about the holy birds. And Brother Theobald, for all his setbacks, remained convinced that he had been close, very close to a breakthrough. It is easy to dismiss such efforts as folly, but to do so would miss the heart of them. These were not inventions of arrogance, nor born from dreams of coin or fame. They were acts of hope, crafted from the belief that the world might be made easier, kinder, lighter, even if only by a thread of parchment carried on a raven's wing. So let us remember them not as failures, but as gentle echoes of an age that dared to imagine differently. Night gathers once more, the lanterns dim in the cloister, and somewhere beyond the orchard perhaps, a raven still wheels above the abbey's tower, gliding silently across the sleeping fields. In the soft hush of early spring, when the frost still clung to the roots of the garden wall, but the first snowdrops had already pushed through the earth, the Abbey of Saumur settled once more into its rhythms. Yet within the stone bones of its workshop, Brother Theobald remained restless. Though the ravens had failed to carry the messages of the brethren, his dreams had not stilled. They fluttered, instead, toward a new dilemma, one both ancient and unrelenting: how to ease the aches of the weary. The Abbey, like many across Christendom, was home to both the healthy and the ailing. The old, the stooped, and the broken-handed often sought refuge within its walls. Brother Alan, whose back had been twisted since a fall from a scaffolding 3 winters past, shuffled through the cloisters with slow, aching steps. Sister Sabine, from the visiting convent, could barely lift her hands to embroider without wincing. Theobald watched them closely, not with pity, but with the thoughtful gaze of one searching for remedy in contrivance. Thus came into being one of his most peculiar undertakings, the automatic leech chair. It began with an observation. The Abbey's physician, Brother Mathieu, believed firmly in the balancing of humors. Bloodletting, he taught, was essential for clearing excess heat from the body, calming fevers, and even improving melancholia. And though it was a practice accepted without much question, it was also a tedious and, to many, dreadful affair. The leeches, kept in a small clay basin at the back of the infirmary, were stubborn, slow, and more than once managed to escape, causing minor chaos in the refectory. Brother Theobald, who abhorred inefficiency more than he feared blood, envisioned a solution. He constructed a grand chair from ash and birch, fitted with sliding wooden trays, small copper bowls, and a lattice of hollow reeds connected to a basin beneath. The seat reclined slightly and was padded with old cloths and sheepskin to calm the patient's nerves. But the true marvel was hidden within the arms of the chair, a mechanism of pulleys and levers which, when activated by a foot pedal, would lower a small iron bracket containing a single leech onto the patient's arm, hold it in place for a set number of minutes, and then gently remove it into a waiting jar below. He explained it to the Abbey Council as a harmonious balance of mercy and machinery. For once, there was genuine interest. Brother Mathieu, ever curious about the practical application of medical theory, agreed to supervise its use. And so, on a morning heavy with mist, the first trial began. The subject was Brother Hugo, a kindly but robust monk who had agreed, with some reluctance, to the procedure. He was seated in the chair, his left sleeve rolled up, while Theobald adjusted the height of the bracket. A faint smell of vinegar lingered in the air, the scent used to rouse the leech from dormancy. With a gentle press of the pedal, the contraption whirred to life. What followed was not harmony. The bracket descended, but too swiftly, striking Brother Hugo's arm with a clack that startled both patient and spectators. The leech, confused and perhaps offended, refused to attach. Theobald adjusted a knob and tried again, this time slower, but the mechanism had already misaligned. Instead of lowering the creature gently, it twisted sideways and flung the leech into the air. Gasps filled the room as the black worm-like creature arced through the air and landed squarely on the abbot's sandal-clad foot. Panic broke out. Brother Hugo leapt from the chair, knocking over the basin. The abbot shouted. The leech, sensing an opportunity, latched onto the nearest warm flesh and was only removed with much shrieking and 2 hands' worth of sea salt. In the scuffle, one of the copper bowls cracked, and the chair itself tipped sideways with a mournful groan. For a while afterward, the infirmary was quieter. No one spoke openly against Brother Theobald's invention, but the leech chair remained unused, tucked into the corner behind an unused herbs cabinet, slowly gathering dust. Still, in the quiet moments after prayer, some of the younger brothers would sneak glances at it. They whispered of its strange elegance, its promise of ease, and the hope, however faint, that it might one day be perfected. Brother Theobald, for his part, accepted the incident with his usual calm. He made no excuses. He merely noted, with faint amusement, that the leeches may possess a more complex temperament than previously understood. Then he moved on, his mind already uncoiling another strand of inspiration. It is easy to imagine these moments only in terms of their outcome. The chair did not succeed, the letters did not fly, the wheel did not turn as it ought, but each failure left behind a sort of echo, soft, wistful, and oddly endearing. In a time when most lived by tradition and repetition, Theobald dared to deviate, even if his contraptions fell short of grace. Outside the abbey, spring deepened. Violets bloomed at the base of the walls, and lambs called faintly from distant hills. Within, candlelight danced along the workshop's walls, casting long shadows of gears and livers. And in the quiet, Theobald scribbled again, something about harnessing heat from the hearth to warm a room more evenly. But that, like all his wonders, would be a story for another night. For now, the birds roost above the chapel window. The wind stirs gently through the cloister gardens. And the leech chair, quiet at last, creaks faintly in the dark, as if remembering its single chaotic moment of glory. The days grew longer, stretching like golden ribbons over the sloping vineyards beyond the abbey walls. Swallows stitched the sky with their flight, and the meadows began to hum with the quiet music of spring. The bells of summer rang gently, announcing the changing hours, and within the shelter of the abbey, life passed with measured calm. But inside the workshop, half sanctum, half storeroom, Brother Theobald wrestled with yet another dilemma that had long troubled his mind. This time, it was not reading or medicine or the transportation of messages that occupied him, but something altogether more modest, though no less vital, the simple act of mealtime. The abbey's refectory, while functional, suffered from the universal inconveniences of its age. Meals were served on long wooden tables, and the food, often stew, porridge, or bread, was carried from the kitchen in heavy earthenware pots. The effort of transporting these steaming vessels fell, as always, to the youngest novices, who stumbled awkwardly under their weight, scalding their hands and occasionally spilling broth across the flagstones. There were murmurs of annoyance, though never loud, and whispers of burned fingertips behind cupped hands. Brother Theobald watched it all with increasing concern, not for the spilled stew, but for the wasted energy. He believed, firmly, that every motion in the abbey should be purposeful. Why, he asked himself, should a young brother carry food when it might be brought to the table by some clever device? Why should effort be spent on something that could be made simple? Thus was born the concept of his fourth invention, one as charming as it was disastrous, the self-pulling serving cart. At first glance, it was an enchanting sight. Crafted from oak and walnut, the cart stood at waist height, with 4 polished wheels, iron-rimmed and sturdy. Upon its flat surface, sat a trio of nested bowls, secured by thin ropes of linen to prevent slippage. Beneath the cart, however, was where the marvel began. Theobald had fashioned a system of cogs and springs, powered by a thickly coiled rope twisted like the string of a crossbow. When wound tight and released by a lever, the rope would slowly unwind, propelling the wheels forward at a gentle pace. A rudimentary guidance system, based on pulleys and notched grooves in the floor, was meant to direct the cart along a predetermined path. He called it the Blessed Meal Bearer. The demonstration was held after sext, with the midday light pouring through the stained glass windows in soft columns of color. A path had been cleared in the refectory, and the brothers sat in eager rows, bowls in hand, watching as Theobald positioned the cart near the entrance, where it was loaded with steaming dishes of lentils and root vegetables. He gave a short prayer, adjusted the guiding pin, and released the tension on the rope. At first, it was perfection. The cart rolled forward smoothly, the bowls wobbling only slightly. A murmur of admiration moved through the assembly. It glided past Brother Henry, who clapped once and whispered something about a minor miracle. Theobald's chest swelled with quiet pride. But as with all such triumphs, the moment did not last. Near the middle of the refectory, the rope snagged. A sudden lurch sent the cart veering left, striking the leg of the abbot's chair with a loud thud. One of the bowls tipped, splashing lentil stew across the hem of his robe. Gasps echoed. The cart, now freed from the rope's steady control, gathered momentum as the coiled spring unwound too quickly. It careened down the aisle, spilling its contents with each jolt. Brother Pascal tried to catch it, but the wheel caught his foot, and he stumbled into Brother Lucien, whose bowl went flying. The cart finally crashed into the far wall with a clatter of splintered wood and a hiss of steam. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the slow dripping of stew down the stone. Brother Theobald stood very still. No one spoke ill of him, not to his face. The brothers respected his mind, even if they no longer trusted his machines. The abbot, his robe still damp, nodded stiffly and returned to his meal. And Theobald, ever the scholar, knelt beside the ruined cart, inspecting the snapped spring and the warped wheel with a kind of calm detachment. That evening, while the others walked in the garden or read quietly in the scriptorium, he sat alone at his workbench. A bowl of untouched lentils rested beside him. He did not eat. Instead, he scribbled on parchment by the light of a single candle, making notes about balance, weight distribution, and the softness of floor stones. He murmured softly to himself, calculations and corrections falling from his lips like prayers. Later, when the rest of the abbey had gone to sleep, he returned to refectory and collected the broken cart himself, carrying it piece by piece to the workshop. No one saw him. No one heard him. But the next morning, the air in the workshop was filled with the scent of freshly sanded wood and hot glue. It is easy to forget how many inventions are born not from need, but from a dream, a vision of how the world might work better, if only things could be nudged just slightly into place. Theobald, for all his misfires, had a heart that longed to help, to lighten, to improve. And though his efforts were rarely rewarded, he never stopped believing in the power of small improvements. The self-pulling serving cart never returned. Its memory lived on, gently in the smiles of the novices as they carried their trays once more by hand, perhaps with a little more care and certainly with a touch more humor. And as for Theobald, he was already turning to his next idea, something about harnessing rainwater to power a laundry drum. But that tale, like all the others, must wait for the coming night, when the stars are high and the world is quiet enough to dream again. The spring rains arrived without ceremony, first as a soft mist brushing against the slate rooftops, then in earnest, steady, silver streams pattering against windows, pooling in the flagstone seams, and turning the abbey gardens into a patchwork of mud and trembling petals. The air grew cool and fragrant, filled with the scent of wet earth and lavender, crushed beneath dripping sandals. Life within the abbey walls grew more hushed, more internal, as if the stone itself had curled inward to wait out the storm. It was during this season of damp sleeves and steaming cloaks that Brother Theobald embarked upon his next invention, an undertaking born not from ambition or the promise of progress, but from a much more intimate discomfort: the burden of laundry. Few tasks were more tedious than laundering the garments of an entire abbey. Every week, the novices hauled great bundles of soiled robes and bedding to the wash troughs near the cloister wall. There, beneath a lean-to roof, they scrubbed and wrung and rinsed by hand, their fingers chapped and red from the cold water. Rain or shine, the work continued, for the linen would not clean itself, or so it had always been. But Brother Theobald, ever watchful, ever restless, had begun to wonder. Why should arms ache and backs bend when the world already moved in circles? Wheels turned, water flowed. Surely, he thought, the labor of cleansing cloth could be shared with nature itself. Thus emerged his next invention, the rain-powered laundry drum. Constructed over several weeks in the shadow of the cloister garden, the device resembled a large wooden barrel set upright on a rotating base. The drum's inner walls were lined with small wooden paddles and iron teeth meant to agitate the garments. A removable lid, sealed with waxed linen, kept the contents secure during rotation. But the most remarkable feature sat just above it, a long funnel-like chute that extended up toward the abbey's rooftop gutters. Theobald's principle was elegant. When the rains came, and they always came, the water would be diverted from the roof through the chute, pouring directly into a side chamber. There, the collected weight of falling rain would gradually fill a suspended bucket tied to a release mechanism. When heavy enough, the bucket would drop, tugging a rope that set the drum spinning on its axis. As the drum turned, it would jostle the clothes within, sloshing them through a mixture of water and soapwort, until, by his calculations, they were at least acceptably clean. He unveiled it during one of the heavier storms, with the brothers gathered under cloaks and umbrellas, their expressions a mix of wonder and resignation. Theobald loaded the drum with several worn habits, added a generous scoop of crushed herbs, and waited. The rain came steadily, thudding onto the chute, gurgling into the chamber below. Bit by bit, the bucket filled, groaning on its pulley. The tension in the rope grew taut. Theobald leaned in, eyes bright behind fogged spectacles. And then, with a splash, the bucket dropped. For a moment, the device performed admirably. The rope pulled taut, the base turned, and the drum began its solemn revolution. A slow, groaning creak echoed across the courtyard, and the brothers murmured in appreciation. The garments inside could be heard swishing gently, as if the rain itself were now a servant of the abbey. But it did not last. Unbeknownst to Theobald, the wax lining inside the drum had not fully cured. As the rain seeped in and the drum spun, the wax began to soften and peel. Soon, water leaked into the outer mechanism, causing the wood to swell unevenly. The drum's balance shifted. One of the paddles came loose, then another. The contraption gave a sudden lurch and tipped forward with a crash, spewing half-washed robes into a puddle. The remaining contents, suds, broken slats, and a twisted iron bracket, splattered across Brother Dennis's boots. The spinning ceased. The rain, indifferent, continued to fall. No one laughed, at least not cruelly. There was too much affection for Theobald, too much admiration buried beneath the amusement. Instead, the brothers simply picked up the soggy habits and returned to the lean-to, wringing them out by hand as they always had. Theobald, soaked to the bone, stood beside the wreckage with a solemn dignity. He did not speak for several minutes, but in time, he lifted the broken paddle from the mud and nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps, he murmured, a counterweight system might offer greater control. That evening, as thunder murmured over the hills and candlelight flickered against damp stone, he dried his robe beside the fire and began sketching anew. His parchment was stained with water spots, but the ink held firm. The idea had not died, only retreated, waiting to return in better form. It is worth pausing to reflect on what these failures meant, not to the world, but to the man who bore them. Theobald was not mocked nor scorned. In truth, the brothers came to see his inventions as a kind of shared parable, a quiet, ongoing testament to the strange glory of trying. Because in every clattering wheel, every wayward pulley, and every waterlogged robe, there was something noble. The belief that even the smallest discomfort might be lessened through a bit of cleverness and care. That perhaps one day, no novice need shiver beneath the rain to serve others. The rain-powered laundry drum was never rebuilt. But long after it had been dismantled and its parts used for kindling, some still remembered the way it had turned, if only for a moment, at the will of falling rain. And so the abbey slept once more, wrapped in storm song and candlelight. The rain struck the windows like gentle fingers, and Theobald, in his workshop, dreamed quietly of fire, of warmth, and of light, his next invention already stirring in the shadows. The rains gave way to a fleeting hush, that rarest of intervals, when the clouds part just long enough for light to brush against the damp earth like a hand on worn fabric. A faint mist hovered over the Abbey gardens, catching on the fresh green tips of rosemary and sage. Birds, dazed from the downpour, fluttered cautiously among the eaves, and the sun, though shy, cast its golden gaze through narrow slits in the cloister walls. In the quiet heart of this tentative reprieve, Brother Theobald set his eyes upon a new frontier, warmth. The abbey was old, built of stone, hewn in generations long past, its walls thick, enduring, and cold. During winter, even spring and autumn, the chill seemed to seep through every crevice, curling around ankles and stiffening fingers during morning prayers. Fires were kept in the hearths, yes, but the heat rarely traveled far, and many a brother wrapped himself in layers of wool beneath his robe, clutching a candle stub as much for warmth as for light. Theobald believed this hardship unnecessary. If fire already existed, why should it not serve more generously? Why should warmth be confined to the hearth when it might be channeled, shared, spread like scripture itself? Thus began his next endeavor, the heated floor grid. Inspired by whispered stories of Roman hypocausts, those ancient systems of underfloor heating whose ruins lay far to the south, Theobald resolved to create something similar, though more humble, and adapted to the limitations of a modest monastic life. He chose the scriptoria as his testing ground, for it was there the cold struck hardest. Ink would stiffen in its wells, and fingers would tremble mid-sentence. The design was bold. He dug shallow channels beneath the flagstones of the scriptorium, no deeper than the width of a boot, and laid within them narrow clay pipes, fashioned with the help of Brother Alam from the potter's shed. These were to carry heated air from a small furnace placed just outside the wall, far enough to avoid smoke within, close enough to share its warmth. Over the pipes he placed thin wooden slats, then laid the stones atop them once more, carefully, whispering a quiet prayer at each placement. The air, he reasoned, would travel through the pipes, warming the stones above, and thus gently heating the room. He called the system Domus Caelestis, the heavenly house. The brothers watched its construction with quiet fascination. Few understood the intricacies, but they trusted the hands that worked them. When the furnace was finally lit and the first soft hiss of heat passed through the pipes, there was genuine excitement. Ink pots were uncorked, quilts were left aside, and for a moment the chill did indeed seem to lift. But as with all dreams stitched from cleverness, the warmth did not last. The pipes, handmade and uneven, expanded with the first flush of heat. Cracks formed. One of the joints, poorly sealed, burst beneath the central stone. Hot air began to leak into the soil, and moisture from the rain-swollen earth rose in response. The wooden slats swelled. The stones shifted. At first it was subtle, a faint buckling, a low creak. Then, with a slow groan, one of the tiles lifted at the edge, tipping an inkstand into Brother Felix's lap. Still, they persisted. Theobald redoubled his efforts, sealing cracks with beeswax and mixing crushed ash into the mortar for resilience. But the damage had begun, and the scriptorium floor, once a silent, solid comfort, now gave soft clicks and sighs with every footstep. In time, a persistent warmth did develop, but so too did the smell of damp wood and faintly scorched moss. The final misfortune came in the form of a rat. Drawn by the newfound heat, the creature had burrowed into the soft soil beneath the pipes and gnawed through a weakened segment. The resulting breach allowed smoke to seep up through the floorboards, curling around the ankles of the copyists like the breath of some invisible spirit. It was Brother Pierre who first shouted, thinking the floor had caught fire. Panic scattered parchment like startled doves. The furnace was doused, the stones lifted once more, and Domus Caelestis was quietly dismantled. Theobald did not protest. He merely knelt by the broken tiles, brushed a hand across the now cooled pipe, and whispered something that might have been a blessing or a farewell. But the brothers remembered. Even as they returned to their scarves and fingerless gloves, they spoke of the morning when warmth had briefly touched the floor, when ink had flowed like spring water, and their breath had not fogged the page. They remembered the ambition beneath the failure, and the kindness that warmed more surely than any fire. That night, as the last light died behind the hills and the abbey settled once more into its nightly hush, Theobald sat by the hearth, sketching quietly. A kettle hissed over the flame. His notes bore the early signs of something new, a vessel perhaps, or a frame, something that turned with the wind. But the tale of that invention, like all the others, shall wait for another night. For now, let the fire burn low, the ink dry gently on the page, and the stone floor cool beneath woolen socks. The abbey sleeps, and Brother Theobald, ever dreaming, dreams still. The winds returned in early summer, not with the sharp bite of winter's edge, but with a dry, swirling restlessness that stirred leaves and lifted the hems of robes with a whisper. The sky, so often heavy with cloud or cloaked in twilight mist, now stretched wide and blue over the abbey's tiled roof. The swallows flew higher, the bells rang clearer, and Brother Theobald, as ever, looked upward and thought, perhaps the wind itself might be made to serve. He had watched it for weeks, the way it danced across the hills, tugged at laundry on the lines, and sent prayer pages tumbling across the courtyard. It moved with invisible power, ungoverned, unseen, and yet persistent. It stirred everything it touched, save the stubborn stones of the abbey itself. And that stubbornness, in Theobald's mind, was precisely the problem. What if, he mused one morning, as he sipped a modest cup of warm goat's milk, we built with the wind, not against it? Thus was born his most ambitious folly yet, the Abbey Wind Harvester. The plan was bold, perhaps even grandiose. Theobald would erect a tower upon the western slope of the Abbey's grounds, just above the old vegetable garden where the breeze rarely ceased. Upon this tower he would mount a great wheel, carved of wood and affixed with broad, curved veins like the petals of a turning sunflower. These veins, he explained to a mildly perplexed Brother Benoit, would catch the wind's passage and convert its motion into turning force. That force, through a chain of wooden gears, would then be directed downward into a chamber where it could power any number of mechanisms. A mill for grinding grain, perhaps, or a fan to circulate air through the deeper corridors. It was to be, in Theobald's eyes, not merely an invention, but a gift to the future. Construction began in the middle of June. The tower was raised from timber hewn by Brother Mathieu and Brother Denis, and for weeks the courtyard rang with the sounds of mallet and chisel. Theobald himself carved each vein of the windwheel by hand, shaping the curve with a loving patience. On the final day of assembly, the entire abbey gathered to watch as the wheel was hoisted into place. 8 great blades affixed to a central hub, each painted with a different symbol of the Gospels. When the breeze caught it that first time, and the wheel began its slow, deliberate rotation, a cheer rose from the assembled brothers. Even the abbot smiled, briefly, but unmistakably. For 2 days, the wheel turned steadily. The gears below creaked into motion, turning a small grain mill inside the chamber with surprising consistency. The flour it produced, though coarse, bore the scent of success. Theobald glowed with quiet satisfaction. But nature, ever capricious, had not yet rendered her judgment. On the 3rd night, the wind rose. It began as a strong, steady current, the kind that whistled through the cracks and shutters and lifted cloaks from pegs. But by midnight it had grown, a keening, insistent gale that rattled doors and bent the cypress trees toward the chapel. The wind wheel, which had spun serenely only hours before, now shrieked with each turn, its vanes catching the gusts with violent energy. The tower shuddered. Inside his cell, Theobald awoke to the sound of groaning timbers. He dressed quickly and made his way to the slope, lantern in hand. The wheel was spinning uncontrollably now, the gears beneath screaming in protest. The grain mill had been abandoned, its hopper knocked from the platform, flour scattered like white ash across the stones. Brother Theobald moved to engage the brake, a heavy lever meant to slow the wheel's rotation, but the mechanism jammed, clogged with wind-blown dust and warped by the sudden strain. The wheel turned faster. A vane cracked. Another splintered, flinging shards into the night. The tower swayed. Then, with a final wrenching sigh, the windwheel tore from its mooring and sailed free, cartwheeling once through the moonlit air before shattering against the cloister wall in a burst of wood and dust. Silence fell, broken only by the wind, which now seemed to mock the stillness. At dawn, the brothers found Theobald kneeling amid the wreckage, turning a piece of broken gear in his hands. He did not weep, nor did he speak. He only traced the grain of the shattered wood with his thumb, as if memorizing the failure by feel. The tower was taken down before the week was out. The remaining wood was salvaged for firewood and repairs. The stone dent left by the flying wheel remained for years, a faint scar that the moss refused to cover. And yet, not all was lost. In the days that followed, the brothers found themselves speaking more often of the wind. They studied its patterns, predicted its moods. Brother Henri even began charting its rise and fall in a small notebook, hoping to find a gentler hour for prayer. And among the novices, the tale of the flying wheel became a favorite, a parable about pride, perhaps, but also about courage. For what, after all, is invention if not a willingness to harness what cannot be held? Brother Theobald returned to his workshop. He mended the window cracked by falling debris. He swept up the flour, and in the stillness that followed, he began to sketch once more, this time something smaller. Something that did not require towers or wind, but simply the steady drip of time itself. But that, like all his wonders, would wait for another night. Now, the wind has calmed. The gardens sway gently in the dark, and in the great hush of the abbey's sleep, you may still hear the faint creak of a wheel that spun too far, too fast, and too freely. Guided only by a dream, the days drifted softly into the heart of summer, and the abbey of Salmer bathed in a drowsy kind of warmth. The stone walls, often so cold and unyielding, now breathed gently with stored sunlight, and even the shadows beneath the cloister arches seemed to shimmer with a golden hush. Bees hummed in lazy spirals through the herb garden. The brothers moved more slowly, their robes brushing over the warm stones like drifting sails. And Brother Theobald, ever loyal to the rhythm of necessity, turned his thoughts to time itself. Time, he often mused, was the one thing no one could bend. The bells of the abbey marked it with stern precision. Matins before dawn, lauds in the blue hush of morning, vespers when the sun began to sigh toward the hills. Yet not every brother moved with equal grace within these rhythms. Some forgot. Some drifted. Some, especially the novices, arrived late to prayer, to meal, to labor, their minds lost in studies or dreams. Theobald, ever the problem solver, wondered, could time be made visible, even audible, in a way more gentle than the abrupt clang of bells? Might there be a means to bring time closer to the heart, so that even the most forgetful might walk in harmony with its beat? Thus began his next invention, what he solemnly named the chronosensor. The concept was deceptively simple. It began with an old brass censer, the kind used in processions, suspended by 3 chains from a wrought iron stand. Inside, instead of coals and incense, Theobald placed a small brass vessel filled with water and a tightly coiled length of rope made from flax, soaked in oil and infused with lavender and sage. The rope would burn slowly, precisely measured, and as it passed a certain point, it would loosen a pin, which in turn caused a small pellet of scented resin to drop onto the hot brass plate below. A puff of perfumed smoke would rise, and the censer would chime once, a single, soft note, produced by a thin metal reed hidden within the chamber. Each hour would release a slightly different fragrance, cypress at prime, thyme at terce, rose at sext, and myrrh at compline. The chime would not startle, but soothe. Time, Theobald reasoned, could be a companion rather than a command. He presented it first to the novices, placing the chronosensor on a stand near the scriptorium entrance. The first day passed without incident. The novices, curious but cautious, paused to sniff the air whenever a new scent drifted past. Brother Lucien even claimed the sext aroma made him feel exceptionally charitable. But by the 3rd day, the first flaw emerged. The oil-soaked rope, so carefully measured, began to burn unpredictably in the rising summer heat. The hours blurred. The censer chimed for none when it should have chimed for terce. The novices grew confused and, worse, entirely relaxed. Brother Pascal arrived at matins humming a secular song and claiming it was still dusk. Theobald adjusted the mechanism, placing a small clay pan of water beneath the censer to cool the chamber. This solved the issue for a time. But then came the bees. Drawn by the scented oils, the abbey's bees, peaceful, industrious, and typically indifferent to invention, began to swarm the censer during its late afternoon cycles. One even became trapped inside the chamber, causing a strange stuttering hum instead of the usual chime. The resulting confusion led to Brother Henry mistaking the bee's buzzing for an angelic visitation and attempting to bow mid-copying, smudging an entire page of illuminated psalms. More adjustments followed. Theobald added a mesh cover, adjusted the rope's saturation, and even attempted to inscribe tiny runes on the brass in hopes that some sacred geometry might lend the device stability. But the final undoing came quietly, as such things often do. Late one evening, long after Compline, a forgotten censer, left lit in the hallway between the chapel and the refectory, released its scent of myrrh at an unscheduled hour. The smell, mingling with the drafts from the stone corridors, spread through the abbey like incense at a funeral. Brothers stirred. A rumor passed from cell to cell that someone had died in the night. Within an hour, half the abbey was awake, whispering prayers for the unnamed departed. The next morning, the censer was removed. Theobald offered no defense. He simply bowed, gathered the device in his arms, and carried it back to the workshop, the faint scent of sage clinging to his sleeves. Still, not all had gone to waste. The brass chamber, polished and burnished from use, was later repurposed into a true censer, its soft ring forever reminding the brothers of a time when fragrance kept watch over their hours. And the idea, the dream of time made gentle, lingered in the minds of many, long after the chronocensor's quiet retirement. Brother Theobald, for his part, returned to his parchments with undimmed resolve. His sketches, once devoted to the rhythm of hours, now curled toward another mystery, movement itself. The winding of ropes, the stepping of feet, the very way the body moved through space. There, he believed, lay a problem yet to be solved. But that tale, like the passage of hours themselves, must unfold in its own time. Outside, the night deepened. The scent of lavender faded into the still air, and somewhere, perhaps only in memory, a soft chime rang once, for no hour in particular, only for the peace that follows the attempt. The haze of midsummer thickened over the abbey like a great woolen mantle, settling into the cracks between stones, pressing heat into every corridor and chamber. The monks moved languidly beneath the burden of the sun, their chants slower, their walks more deliberate. Meals were lighter, prayers shorter, and even the bees droned with a kind of sleepy reverence. It was during this season, when the world seemed to stretch and sweat beneath a golden yoke, that Brother Theobald turned his thoughts to feet. He had long been fascinated by motion, the humble miracle of putting one foot before the other. Though often dismissed as mere necessity, walking was, to him, a kind of grace. Yet as the years wore on, he noticed how many of the elder brothers limped through the cloisters with pained steps, their joints stiff, their sandals worn smooth at the heel. He himself had begun to feel the quiet ache in his knees each morning. And one day, watching Brother Anselm wince as he stood from prayer, Theobald whispered to himself, "There must be a better way." And so he began his ninth invention, the ambulatory frame of St. Gallen. At first glance, it appeared more like a contraption of penance than comfort. Constructed from a lattice of ashwood and hornbeam, the frame rose to shoulder height and encircled the user in a wheeled harness that bore most of their weight. Thick padded straps supported the torso, while curved wooden braces cradled the legs. A system of cords and levers, operated by the hands or elbows, allowed the user to walk by shifting their body forward, which triggered a synchronized movement of the wheels beneath. It was, in Theobald's words, a sacred collaboration between man and machine, neither wholly bearing the burden, but sharing it in peace. The first trial was held in the long colonnade just behind the scriptorium. Brother Anselm, ever brave and trusting, volunteered as the inaugural user. He was fitted carefully into the frame, his arms supported, his knees secured. At first, he looked like a man standing within a ship's rigging. The brothers watched with bated breath. Theobald whispered a blessing, adjusted the levers, and gave a gentle push. The frame moved. Slowly, haltingly, it rolled forward, each step of Brother Anselm mirrored by the soft creak of the wooden mechanism. The wheels turned, the braces flexed. For a few glorious moments it seemed to work. Anselm smiled, a young novice clapped, Theobald beamed. But as always, fate had its own plans. The colonnade floor, though swept daily, was uneven in places. A shallow rise in the stone caught the front wheel. The frame jolted. Anselm, startled, shifted his weight too quickly. One of the elbow cords snapped. The frame twisted slightly, one wheel lifting off the ground. Anselm pitched forward, Not entirely, but just enough for the frame to tip onto its side with a great wooden groan. He was unhurt, but wholly entangled. It took 3 brothers to extract him, and 2 more to free the frame from the stone gutter into which it had fallen. Undeterred, Theobald returned to his bench and made adjustments. Larger wheels, better shock absorption using goose feather padding, and stronger tension in the elbow cords. But the second trial, held 3 days later, ended when the wheels began to squeal unbearably against the stones, drawing a flock of geese from the nearby meadow who believed one of their own was in distress. The third and final attempt came a week later, with Brother Guillaume, a smaller man, lighter and less prone to sudden movement. The trial went well for nearly half an hour. Guillaume moved from the colonnade to the edge of the herb garden and back, even managing a slow circle around the fountain. But then, quite without warning, a strap came loose. The frame did not collapse. Instead, it sagged in the middle, causing the wooden leg braces to splay outward. Guillaume sank into a squat, suspended awkwardly within the structure like a puppeteer's doll mid-dance. There he remained, patiently reciting Psalm 131 until help arrived. The ambulatory frame of St. Galen was retired shortly thereafter, with quiet ceremony and no small affection. It was dismantled and its wood repurposed, some of it for shelving in the infirmary, where its legacy continued in a way. And yet, something lingered. The elder monks, once reluctant to discuss their ailments, began to speak more freely of their discomfort. Cushions were provided for the choir stalls. Soft mats were laid in the scriptorium. And though no one walked in a frame again, many walked with greater awareness of their steps, their balance, and the quiet grace it took to simply move from one place to another. As for Theobald, he accepted the frame's failure with his usual serenity. He spent the following days sitting near the well, sketching small devices to ease the burden of lifting water, muttering occasionally about pulleys, tension, and counterweights. But those were thoughts for another time. For now, the abbey exhaled beneath the summer sky. The breeze carried the scent of sun-warmed stone and rosemary. And Brother Theobald, with sore knees and ink-smudged fingers, sat beneath the arch of a fig tree, dreaming quietly of small improvements and gentler steps. Reading in a slow, gentle, and sleep-inducing storyteller voice with a calm medieval ambience. Let us begin again, slowly, softly. In the year of our Lord, 1371, in a small hamlet nestled between low hills and dripping willows, there lived a monk by the name of Brother Aelric. His order was known for its devotion not only to the sacred texts, but to the preservation and improvement of human health. It was from this blend of piety and curiosity that Brother Aelric conceived one of the most unusual instruments ever to emerge from the cloistered walls of a medieval infirmary, the blood harmonizer. A curious name for a curious device. You see, Brother Aelric believed, most fervently, that not all ills of the flesh came from humors or spirits, but from disharmony in the blood itself. He had observed how some men were quick of temper and others slow, some rosy and hale, while others waned pale and sallow, as though their very blood were arguing with itself beneath the skin. Inspired by the belief that harmony brought health and dissonance bred disease, Brother Aelric set about constructing a device he believed could soothe the blood into alignment. The blood harmonizer was a contraption not unlike a small spinning wheel, fixed to a wooden stand and adorned with tiny silver chimes. A patient would be seated before it, sleeves rolled up, while the device was placed near their arm and turned gently by an apprentice. Inside, a series of magnets, primitive and of uncertain origin, were set to spin while bells chimed faintly in response to the rotating motion. Aelric believed that through this subtle vibration, the blood might be sung into harmony, the way a choir might tune its voices before a hymn. At first, his brethren humored him. Monks are, after all, patient folk, and they watched with quiet amusement as Brother Aelric administered his musical treatments to the weak and weary. Yet soon, something stranger began to unfold. Those who visited the infirmary began reporting odd sensations. Not pain, not quite, but a buzzing, a tingling, a heaviness in the arms and legs. A few felt dizzy. Some claimed to smell iron when there was none present. One fellow, a visiting merchant with a persistent cough, claimed that he dreamt of wolves howling under a red moon after only one session with the harmonizer. Still, Brother Aelric pressed on, convinced these were the effects of the blood aligning itself with celestial balance. The more peculiar the symptoms, the more convinced he became that his invention was working. But outside the monastery, word began to spread. By the frostbitten months of that same year, pilgrims from distant counties arrived, seeking the Harmonizer's healing tone. They paid in eggs and wool, coins and candles. They waited for hours, sometimes days, to sit before the humming device, their faces pale with hope. And the monks, though wary, allowed it. For the tithe grew, and the monastery grew warmer and fuller with each passing week. Yet even amid this swelling popularity, cracks began to show. One elderly man, cured of his shaking hands for a brief time, returned days later, claiming his blood now, whispered in sleep. Another wept at night, unable to rest, convinced that his limbs no longer belonged to him. A child who had once walked with a limp returned, no longer limping, but twitching in the legs every few minutes as though strings pulled from below. By winter's deepness, concern turned to alarm. The Harmonizer, it seemed, was not merely a curious failure. It was an invention that had begun to disturb the very balance it sought to restore. Brother Aelric refused to accept this, and in desperation, he began enhancing the machine. He added more magnets, reshaped the chimes to match musical modes from ancient Greek theory, and even began humming himself during treatments. His voice, low and mournful, echoed off the infirmary walls like wind through catacombs. Yet even this failed to help. The final blow came one night in February, when a nobleman's daughter, pale and sickly but spirited, was brought to the monastery after months of coughing fits. Brother Aelric took her at once to the Harmonizer, convinced he could cleanse her blood. For 2 days he tended her, murmuring, turning the wheel, listening for tones only he could hear. But on the third morning, she did not wake. The monks buried her with prayers, but whispers filled the cold stone halls. That very night, the abbot himself approached Brother Aelric. There were no accusations, only a long silence between them in the candlelit scriptorium. The next morning, the Harmonizer was gone. Some say Aelric dismantled it with his own hands. Others say it was taken and buried far in the hills. But from that day forth, no mention of it appeared again in the records of the order. Brother Aelric himself remained, quiet, humble, and aged beyond his years. He returned to copying psalms and tending herbs. He never again spoke of blood or music or magnets. And yet, on certain quiet nights, when the wind is soft and the candles burn low, some say a faint chime can still be heard in the monastery's infirmary. A thin, quivering note like a memory of something once believed and long since put to rest. So, dear listener, let your eyes grow heavy and your breath slow, for this tale, like the notes of the Harmonizer, drifts now into silence. One more failed invention left behind in the gentle shadows of history. Sleep well, and when you are ready, we shall explore the next strange wonder from the pages of the past. In a time when the black-robed apothecaries still roamed muddy town markets, and the scent of rosemary and charred sage lingered in the corridors of manor halls, there was born another invention, one crafted not from malice nor pride, but from deep and desperate fear. The medieval world, after all, was not a quiet one. It pulsed with anxiety, with unseen forces whispered about in dark corners, and believed to walk beside man at every hour. Spirits, demons, witches, the unseen was as real as rain and as feared as famine. And so, in the autumn of the year 1398, amidst the rustling gold of dying leaves and the curling smoke of peat fires, the villagers of Denfield, a remote and wind-scoured settlement on the edge of an ancient forest, received a curious gift from their baron, the Witch Watcher's lantern. Crafted by the baron's chaplain, Father Roderick, a man as solemn as he was learned, the Witch Watcher's lantern was said to possess the ability to reveal deception. Not of a worldly sort, such as the theft of bread or the telling of lies, but deception born of witchery. It was a brass lantern, wide at the base and tapering to a tall, narrow chimney. Inside, a thick greenish crystal was set before the flame, and upon it, etched in careful script, were runes copied from an old tome Father Roderick claimed to have unearthed beneath the monastery's old stone floor. He claimed that when lit in darkness and held before a person's face, the lantern would betray the presence of witchcraft. Honest faces would remain unchanged in the light's flickering glow, but those who dealt in forbidden arts would appear. Altered, their features would shimmer, Their eyes would flash strangely. Their reflections might vanish altogether. It was not long before the villagers, already weary from a failed harvest and a lingering sickness that left children weak and pale, clung to this new object like a drowning man to driftwood. The lantern was brought into homes, into barns, and even into the chapel. People began whispering, not prayers, but names. "Light the lantern for her," they'd murmur. "She speaks too often to herself. Her cat never leaves her side. She does not bleed as others do." The first to be tested was old Mernhild, the weaver's widow. Her hair, long and unkempt, and her eyes, pale as ash, had always marked her as strange. She sat quietly in the darkened smithy as the lantern was lit before her. The green light washed over her face and all held their breath. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, as the flame flickered, someone gasped. A glimmer, just a brief one, seemed to slide across her cheek. A ripple. A trick of light, perhaps. But fear does not wait for reason. Within the hour, she was dragged to the edge of the woods and locked in a cellar meant for winter apples. Father Roderick proclaimed that she would be watched, studied, questioned gently, but none saw her again. The lantern had spoken. One might hope that such a tool would be used sparingly, with care. But the witch watcher's lantern quickly became more than a tool. It became a symbol, a power, a weapon that needed no proof beyond a shimmer of light and the tension of a crowd's breath. As the days passed, more were brought before it. A traveling tinker with odd stories. A girl who sang to the trees. A boy whose dreams were too vivid. Each claimed innocence. Each stood silently in the lantern's glow. And always someone saw something. A blink, a twitch, a strange shadow not cast by the flame. It did not matter that the crystal was flawed, or that the runes were merely decorative markings from an old brewer's ledger. Nor did it matter that the chimney's narrow vent made the flame flicker unpredictably in even the stillest room. What mattered was the belief. The lantern had become an eye, a voice, and a judge. Father Roderick, for all his supposed wisdom, was not immune to the power he had set loose. When the Baron's own son began showing signs of madness, a shivering, a sudden silence, and then wild laughter, Roderick brought forth the lantern with trembling hands. Before the court, before the boy's own mother, he lit the flame and held it high. And the boy, he smiled. In the greenish light, his eyes gleamed. His teeth seemed too many. The chambermaid screamed. The Baron wept. He was sent away, chained and gagged, to a monastery across the river, where they said holy water could calm the wicked mind. No one spoke of him again. Yet that night, something changed in Roderick. He did not sleep. He paced the chapel alone, lantern in hand, lighting it before statues and relics, before his own reflection in the still water of the font. And when morning came, his chamber was empty. The lantern was found smoldering on the altar, its brass warped by heat, its crystal shattered into green shards like forest glass. They say Father Roderick fled into the woods, raving about lights behind people's eyes, about voices beneath the chant of birdsong. Some say he drowned in the river. Others say he still walks the woods, seeking truth in shadows. As for the villagers of Denfield, they speak less now. The fever passed, the crops returned, but the lantern's memory lingers like the scent of old smoke. Children are warned not to stare too long into candlelight, lest they see things not meant for seeing. The witch watcher's lantern may have been born of fear, but it was fed by longing. The longing to understand, to control, to be safe in a world ruled by uncertainty. It promised clarity, but brought only shadows. And in the end, it joined the long list of well-meaning missteps, a glimmering folly extinguished by its own flame. Sleep now, if you can, under the hush of lamplight and the turning of years. For our journey through these medieval missteps is not yet done. Many more strange inventions await us in the folds of time. In the soft breath of early spring, when snow still clings to the roots of trees and the air smells faintly of thaw and earth, there came to prominence another strange creation, one whose purpose was neither to heal the sick nor unmask witches, but rather to provide comfort to the restless and noble. It was called the sleepless crown. Its origins are draped in velvet and rumor, as many things are when born within courts, where candlelight dances on gold-threaded tapestries, and secrets are traded in whispered glances. The first mention of the sleepless crown appears in the records of Queen Isolde of Valmere, a kingdom now long faded into memory. its flag reduced to a faded scrap in a distant abbey archive. Queen Isolde, for all her renown in foreign diplomacy and her wisdom in the governance of trade, suffered from a grave affliction, an inability to sleep. By her 30th year, she had not known a full night's rest in over a decade. Her eyes, once bright with mirth, grew dull. Her skin thinned, her thoughts wandered. And so her council summoned apothecaries, monks, hedge healers, and even traveling mystics, but none could coax her mind into slumber. It was then that a foreign artisan named Theodoric arrived at court, bearing a gift of curious design, a delicate circlet of iron, set with moonstones, and lined on the inner rim with fine strips of lamb's wool soaked in tinctures of valerian, lavender, and crushed poppy. Theodoric spoke gently, with a voice like cool rain on roof tiles, and claimed the circlet had been inspired by ancient dreams brought to him during an illness in the mountains. He called it the sleepless crown. It was to be worn only at dusk, and only by those of noble lineage, for Theodoric believed that the crown responded not merely to the oils and herbs embedded within, but to a quality he called regal resonance, a fanciful notion that rulers carried in their blood, a frequency unlike that of common folk. The crown, he said, tuned this frequency and allowed the wearer's mind to quiet itself into rest. Queen Isolde, weary and willing, agreed. The first night, the court held its breath. She emerged the next morning with eyes slightly brighter, skin less drawn, and a smile, small and fragile, but real. By the third night, she claimed to have dreamed for the first time in years. She described a meadow she had never seen, birds she could not name, and a warmth across her chest that she likened to a memory of her childhood nursemaid's embrace. The court rejoiced. Theodoric was granted a title, a modest estate, and a workshop near the royal gardens. At once, the sleepless crown became a thing of legend. But as the weeks passed, something shifted. The queen no longer welcomed daylight as she once had. She took to wearing the crown longer and longer into the morning, then into midday. Her counselors noted she grew quiet during meetings. Her speech softened, almost dreamlike. She would gaze beyond windows as if searching for a far-off sound. Then came the afternoon she forgot her steward's name. The physician, Master Ronel, examined the crown and found it warm to the touch, almost unnaturally so. He removed it from her with great caution. That night, the queen did not sleep. She wandered the halls barefoot, murmuring the names of birds none had heard of. Her hands trembled. Her dreams, she whispered, were trying to leave her. Despite protest, she demanded the crown be returned. By midsummer, her entire day was spent in a kind of waking slumber, her gaze distant, her voice floating between sense and story. The queen no longer signed decrees with accuracy. She failed to recognize foreign envoys, and yet she was peaceful, serene even. The council met in secret. Some argued that a restful sovereign was better than a restless one. Others feared that a queen who drifted through hours in a waking dream was no queen at all. Theodoric was summoned. He confessed that he had no knowledge of how the crown truly worked. He had dreamt it, he said, during a fever. Every crown he had attempted since failed to function. It was unique, a singular invention. Still, it was removed from her head by order of the council. Queen Isolde resisted. She wept, she begged, she did not sleep again. Within 3 weeks, she was dead. They buried her beneath the yew trees in a silk-lined tomb. The crown for a time was locked in the deepest vault, but whispers endure. It is said the next ruler, her cousin Aelric, was found staring at it for hours by candlelight until the court mage ordered it destroyed. Yet no fragments remain, only rumors. Some say it was not burned but buried beneath the palace, with a seal of wax and bone. What made the sleepless crown such a failure was not its craftsmanship. It worked. Beautifully. Too beautifully. It promised peace to those whose minds raced and rattled, but it gave no warning about the price of such peace. The cost of stepping too far into the veil of dreams until dreams became one's only home. It was a gift that offered sleep but stole the waking world. Now, when nobles complain of insomnia, they are handed warm milk and sage pillows. But among the oldest keepers of royal archives, there are still those who will murmur, if pressed, about the crown that could still sleep within the earth, humming softly beneath stone, waiting to be worn once more. And so the night deepens. Draw your blanket closer. Let your breath slow. Dream, but not too deeply. For even the most comforting inventions can carry shadows stitched into their silver linings. There is something especially fragile about trust in times of war. When bread is scarce, when news travels slowly and always colored by fear, and when the line between victory and ruin is thinner than the blade of a knight's dagger. It was in just such a time, during the waning years of the 100 Years' War, that a curious invention emerged, one born not of peace, but of desperation. It was called the whisper cage. This device, delicate and sinister in equal measure, came not from a monastery or manor, but from a borderland fortress perched upon the edge of Gascony. There, within the stone-stained walls of Chateau Vallon, lived a captain by the name of Armand de Lezing. A stern man of brittle pride and endless vigilance, Captain Armand had grown weary, not just of siege and skirmish, but of spies. For months, the fortress had suffered subtle sabotage. Stores went missing, arrows were blunted. Mules were found dead in their stables with no visible wound. Even the well water once turned bitter for a full day. The men whispered of curses, but Armand was not a man of superstition. He believed in betrayal, in the rot of fear, and he sought to root it out with a weapon unlike any blade or bow. He called upon an old companion, a scholar turned engineer named Aelric of Fane. Aelric had once studied rhetoric and music, but war had stripped him of ideals, leaving only the machinery of sound and silence. Together, they devised a thing neither wholly machine nor wholly instrument, a narrow bronze coil suspended within a wooden box, lined with threads of sheep gut, bound tight like harp strings stretched to groan. The whisper cage was not meant to confine a person, but a voice. At its center was placed a small wooden chair, with a carved headrest and iron wrist loops. The accused, always someone suspected, though never yet proven, would be seated beneath the coil. When the box was closed around them and the chamber sealed, the design of the walls would amplify and bend every sound. Even the smallest whisper would be caught, stretched, echoed within the chamber, and then funneled upward to a tiny pipe set into the stone wall above, where Captain Armand would sit listening, ear pressed against the pipe, for hours. The idea was simple and chilling. Those within the cage, deprived of company and time, would inevitably talk to themselves. Perhaps not immediately, but after hours or days of silence and flickering torchlight, their minds would turn inward, and their thoughts would spill out into words. And words, as Armand believed, could betray more than actions ever could. The first man placed inside was a cook's apprentice, a boy of 15 with narrow shoulders and eyes too alert for his station. Armand suspected him of reporting supply levels to the English. For 2 nights, the boy sat in the cage. He did not scream. He did not cry. He merely whispered prayers in Breton. But on the 3rd night, his voice faltered. He began to mutter other things, memories, dreams, names. Armand listened, and when he heard the name Aelric, a quartermaster once punished for drunkenness, he took it as proof. Aelric was arrested, and 2 others shortly after. The boy, upon release, was thin and trembling. He spoke little after that and never cooked again. But Armand was satisfied. The whisper cage had begun its work. Soon it was used regularly. For sentries who had fallen asleep at their posts, for soldiers who spoke out of turn, for merchants who asked too many questions about guard rotations. None were harmed, at least not physically. They were merely made to sit, to speak, and to reveal themselves by the shape of their thoughts. Yet not all minds are so easily cornered. One evening, a woman named Sabine was brought to the fortress. She claimed to be a healer, traveling with herbs and books wrapped in cloth. She had arrived during a storm and offered to aid the wounded. Her knowledge was strange, too precise, too confident, and Armand, ever watchful, ordered her placed in the cage. Sabine did not resist. She merely smiled and stepped inside. For 3 nights, Armand listened, but her voice never quivered. She spoke only in riddles, lines of old poetry, songs from places no soldier could name. Sometimes she recited recipes for strange tinctures. Other times she spoke directly to the pipe above her. "I know you are there," she whispered. "Do your bones ache as mine do? Do you sleep less, Captain, now that you are full of secrets?" Armand said nothing. He listened. On the 4th night, she said something that shook him. "Do not mistake a full silence for truth. Even stones, if left alone too long, begin to hum." When the cage was opened the next morning, Sabine was gone. The wooden chair remained empty, and beside it, lay a sprig of yarrow. The guards swore no one had entered. The door had remained locked. But the cage was vacant, and the engineer Aelric, who had grown more pale by the day, was found that evening on the ramparts, muttering about voices that fold in upon themselves. He left the fortress the next day and was never seen again. The whisper cage remained unused from then on. Captain Armand had it sealed behind a false wall, beneath the chapel. But the fortress itself began to change. Soldiers spoke less, even laughter seemed cautious. And at night, when the wind passed through the stones, some swore they could hear murmurs, half-formed words, the breath of thoughts not quite spoken. They say that silence, when twisted too tightly, becomes its own kind of scream. The whisper cage was an invention born of fear, of the desire to find truth where truth would not freely walk. But in forcing silence to speak, it taught that what we learn may not always be what we wish to know. Sometimes the mind protects itself for a reason, and the human heart, when listened to without consent, will yield not secrets but sorrow. Now rest. Let your breath be soft. For our tale winds ever deeper into the dim corridors of time, and not all inventions born in darkness should be followed too far. There is a silence particular to high places, a hush that lives in the rafters of cathedrals and the bell towers of cities forgotten by kings. It is a silence filled with breathless air and feathered shadows, where even the wind tiptoes lest it disturb whatever ancient watchfulness lingers. It was in such a place, tall and cold and hidden beneath time's dust, that the next invention found its brief, unsettling moment in the light. It was called the Skyward Cloak. Its origins remain uncertain, though some believe it was conceived by a sect of monks dwelling in the cliffside monastery of St. Leontius, perched like a stone swallow above the Val of Rune. The brothers there were known not only for their illumination of holy texts, but also for their obsession with ascension, both spiritual and, strangely, physical. The monks believed that drawing closer to the heavens was not merely a matter of prayer, but of elevation. They fasted for days at a time and constructed wooden scaffolds upon which they meditated, arms raised toward the sky. Over decades, their architecture grew perilous, crenellated towers of timber and rope stairways that vanished into clouds. But one among them, Brother Danel, sought something more than scaffolds. He sought to fly. The skyward cloak was the fruit of this impossible yearning, a garment stitched from thin layers of waxed canvas, oiled leather, and the feathers of over 200 birds. It was neither robe nor armor, but something stranger still. Shaped like the wings of a heron and threaded with tiny bone struts, it spread outward from the shoulders and could be drawn tightly about the body or unfurled in what Danel called the embrace of the firmament. He had studied birds obsessively, drawing them in endless charcoal sketches along the margins of psalters and penitential scrolls. He noted the curvature of wings, the tilt of tail feathers, the span and sweep of air beneath the pinions. He believed that God had placed birds in the sky not just for beauty, but as an invitation. The path to heaven, he once wrote in a letter never sent, is not always one of the soul. The body, too, may be lifted. None know precisely how many trials the skyward cloak endured before its first public flight. But in the spring of the year 1411, Brother Danel ascended to the highest point of St. Leontius, a stone outcrop above the great bell tower where only falcons dared nest. And there, before dawn's blush reached the mountains, he leapt. The cloak flared. The feathers shuddered. For a moment, he did not fall. Witnesses below swore he hovered, just barely, gliding along the draft that rose from the valley's basin. He spread his arms, tilted his body, and turned slowly in the air, like a leaf caught in prayer. A cry escaped him, one of triumph and joy. And then the wind shifted, the canvas rippled, the struts bent inward, and the skyward cloak, no longer buoyed by the careful breath of morning, began to collapse. Danel plummeted, not like a stone, but like a broken bird, his cloak flapping desperately against gravity's cold hand. He landed in the monastery's herb garden, just shy of the rosemary beds. He survived, but only barely. His legs were shattered, his spine bent, and his mouth filled with blood. He did not speak again. The brothers, grief-struck and frightened, buried the cloak within the walls of the scriptorium, behind shelves of worm-eaten tomes. They forbade further attempts at ascension. Yet rumors swirled beyond the monastery walls. A passing pilgrim, having glimpsed the flight, carried the tale to the next valley. Within a year, others began to appear with their own interpretations. Parchment wings, glider robes, even wooden frames tied with flax. The skyward cloak, despite its failure, had sparked a quiet obsession. But all who tried met with misfortune. Some were maimed, others died. And slowly the cloak became not a symbol of faith, but of foolishness. A dream too proud, a leap too far. What made the skyward cloak one of the worst inventions of its age was not its lack of function. It had flown, if only for a breath. It was the promise it carried. The cruel, shimmering hope that mankind might defy the order of earth and sky with mere stitching and feathers. It played upon that most tender of longings, the desire to rise above the world, to be unburdened by gravity or grief. But the heavens, it seems, do not yield to clever hands. Years later, when the monastery fell to ruin and vines clawed through its stones, travelers reported seeing birds circling the old tower. Not falcons, but swallows, their flight sharp and joyful. And on quiet mornings, when the mist lifted just so, some swore they saw a shape, broad of wing, gliding silently before vanishing into cloud. They say it was Denel's spirit finally aloft. Or perhaps it was the wind, carrying only memory. So now, as night deepens, let your mind drift, but not too far. For dreams are lovely wings, yes, but not all are meant to carry us skyward. Some are meant to rest, to settle like feathers upon the stillness of sleep. The great cities of the medieval world, stone-clad and soot-stained, ringed by walls and riddled with alleys, were places where ambition burned hot as forge fire and where the sounds of life never truly ceased. Horses clattered on cobblestones, bells rang the hours, merchants cried their wares, and over it all lingered the breath of industry, smoke, shouting, hammer strikes. It was within such a city, amid the chaos of clang and echo, that an invention emerged meant not for healing, nor for dreaming, nor even for war, but for justice. Or so it was claimed. This invention bore a name as solemn as it was final, the balance of guilt. It was devised in the mid-15th century by an alderman named Albrecht von Möhring, who served in the bustling Hanseatic port of Wismar. Albrecht was known for his sense of fairness and a sharp mistrust of words. Tongues are slippery things, he once wrote, but weight does not lie. This belief, born of both weariness and pride, led him to commission a device that would strip ambiguity from the courtroom. The balance of guilt was, at a glance, a simple structure. A great brass scale, taller than a man, supported by a yoke of blackened oak. Its arms stretched out like the wings of a crucifix, and from each side hung a wide pan, wrought in iron and rimmed with runes that none could read. The entire construction was set upon a dais within the city's central hall, where light from a rose-glass window would fall each morning. But its simplicity was a deception. The central premise of the device was this. When two individuals stood accused of a shared crime, say theft or conspiracy, they were each to stand upon one of the pans. No chains, no burden, merely the weight of themselves. Beneath the platform lay a series of mechanisms, hidden gears and counterweights, the design of which was known only to Albrecht and his smith. The accused were to remain still. They were not questioned. They were not cross-examined. Instead, the balance would tilt, slightly, or not at all. According to Albrecht, the mechanism would detect the burden of guilt. The soul, when tarnished by wrongdoing, would press heavier upon the flesh. A guilty man would weigh more than one who was innocent. The difference would be subtle, but enough. He offered no scripture to support this belief, only math and conviction. The first public trial using the balance drew a great crowd. Two brothers stood accused of smuggling spices through the city's old sea gate, an act punishable by branding. They stepped, solemn and pale, into the iron pans. The audience hushed. The magistrate gave the signal, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, one side dipped. That man was declared guilty. His brother, absolved. There was no outcry, no appeal, only the groan of gears and the murmurs of those who watched, wide-eyed and uncertain. Over time, the balance became feared. It was consulted in matters of theft, of betrayal, even of sorcery. Its verdicts were swift and final. Men and women were measured before the law, quite literally, and few dared protest. For how could one argue against weight itself? Yet strange patterns began to emerge. On colder days, the pans behaved erratically. On humid mornings, they seemed to stick. Lighter individuals, slender women, aging monks, were often declared innocent, regardless of testimony. Those with heavier frames, or the natural bearing of laborers, fared poorly. One infamous case involved a baker's apprentice and a friar, both accused of defacing a shrine. The friar, broad-shouldered and well-fed, was declared guilty. The apprentice, narrow and meek, was freed. But a week later, the friar's innocence was proven by another's confession. The apprentice had boasted in a tavern. Aelric blamed improper calibration. He ordered the device serviced, cleaned, adjusted. But whispers spread. People began avoiding public accusation. Some altered their diets before trial, or wore layers of cloth soaked in water. Others paid coin to have neutral days scheduled, when air was dry and sun was fair. The balance of guilt, once feared for its precision, had become a source of superstition. Aelric, now older and plagued by coughing fits, defended it still. "It is not the weight of the body alone," he insisted to his council. "The soul makes itself known in mass, in gravity. There is a pressure to wrongdoing, a weight to lies, the balance knows." But his words no longer held sway. The final blow came when a nobleman's daughter, graceful and slight, was declared guilty of poisoning her husband. The crowd gasped. The family protested. The man had choked on lamprey bones, not poison. Yet the balance had spoken. Aelric, sensing his invention slipping into disgrace, attempted one final demonstration. He stood upon one pan. A convicted murderer was placed upon the other. "Let the city see," he declared, "how justice tips the world." And it did tip. Toward Aelric. He stood frozen. The crowd was silent. "Faulty," he muttered, stepping down. He died 3 days later, alone in his chambers. The balance of guilt was dismantled shortly after. The parts were melted down and used in the casting of a church bell. That bell, they say, rings heavy and low, even now, centuries later. This invention, perhaps more than most, revealed the folly of placing judgment in things not meant to judge. It mistook the body for the soul, the visible for the unseen. In trying to weigh guilt, it instead laid bare the true burden, the arrogance of those who think fairness can be forged in brass. So now, as sleep nears, let all scales be set aside. Let there be no measurement, no tilt, no trial, only stillness and the soft hush of passing time. In the far northern reaches of the old world, where the forests stand tall and thick with pine, and snow gathers in drifts so deep they swallow the shape of roads, there once stood a settlement built on silence, a place of few voices and many secrets. The villagers of Eldholm, wrapped in their woolen cloaks and hunched beneath the weight of winter, were hardy folk, accustomed to hardship, to quiet, and to the long, dark months when the sun merely grazed the sky. It was in this forgotten place, amid frost and firewood, that a curious invention emerged, born from the yearning to communicate across great distances without speech or footfall. They called it the voice jar. Its maker was a man named Fenric Orlan, a solitary figure with wild hair and the bowed back of one who spent too much time bent over a workbench. Once a bell founder in the service of a lord, Fenric had retreated north after the death of his wife. There, he fashioned small miracles, lanterns that burned through blizzards, hinges that sang soft tunes when opened, and a weather vane that always pointed not to the wind, but to home. But his greatest and strangest invention, the one that would come to haunt Eldholm long after the snows had melted, was the voice jar. It was at first glance simple, a clay vessel sealed with wax and capped with a lid of dark pine wood. Etched into the surface were symbols, some Norse, some ecclesiastical, others of Fenric's own making. The interior was lined with thin copper thread, looped like a nest, and connected to a small glass vial embedded in the base. Fenric claimed the voice jar could do something no bell, horn, or runner could achieve. It could capture a voice, hold it, and release it at will. To demonstrate, he invited the village elders to his workshop. He spoke into the open jar. "Spring will come, and with it the green." Then he sealed the lid. Hours later, he unstoppered it, and to the amazement of those gathered, his voice, muffled but distinct, spoke the very same words, as though echoing up from the depths of a well. The effect was chilling. The jar did not merely replay, it remembered. Fenric explained that the copper threads, when warmed by breath and struck by sound, captured the vibrations. The glass vial stored the memory, bound by wax and air. It could hold a message for weeks, months, even years if undisturbed. The villagers were stunned. No longer would hunters need to brave storms to deliver news. Lovers could exchange secrets. Warnings could be spoken once and heard again. Soon, voice jars were traded, borrowed, hoarded. Fenric could barely keep pace with demand. He began crafting specialized jars, some for greetings, others for prayers, others still for farewells. A black-lidded version was reserved for the dead, placed in graves with a final whispered goodbye sealed within. But something changed. One night, a child named Mira unstoppered a jar meant for her father, a hunter lost in the woods weeks prior. The voice that spilled forth was not his. It was deeper, slurred. It wept. "I am not where they buried me," it moaned. "The cold does not end." The family wept, believing it to be his restless spirit. The jar was resealed and placed in the chapel. But it would not fall silent. Even sealed, it whispered. Others followed. A jar meant for a betrothal sang a song that no one had recorded, an old tune, trembling with sorrow. Another, used by a shepherd to recount the stars he'd seen, cracked open to reveal not his voice, but a laughter, sharp and cruel. Fenric, upon hearing these tales, grew pale. He tested one of his early prototypes. Instead of his recorded message, the jar hissed softly and then murmured a string of words in a language he did not know. He stopped making the jars. He said the copper was no longer clean, that the wires remembered too much, that the glass vials, meant to trap air, might be trapping more. He destroyed what he could, buried others in the deep snow, far from hearth and home. But jars do not always stay buried. One spring after the thaw, children found a voice jar in the roots of a split tree. They brought it home, giggling, and unsealed it by the fire. What they heard made the flame dim. Voices layered atop each other. Sobs, screams. One voice repeating the word "listen" again and again until it cracked. The village elders met that night. They ordered all remaining jars collected and broken. Fenric, now gray and thin as a reed, did not protest. He simply said, "I wanted to capture memory. I did not know memory would echo." He died that winter, seated at his bench, a smile frozen on his lips. No jar was found in his home, but his neighbors swore that on certain windless nights, a faint voice could be heard from beneath his floorboards, whispering stories long forgotten. The voice jar was an invention not of violence or cruelty, but of love, of the desire to be heard across time and silence. But the past, once captured, does not always behave. Some memories refuse to remain still. Some words, once spoken, claw their way into the present. And so, let the night take your voice, gently and without capture. Let no jar remember you, save the quiet vessel of your dreams. Sleep now and forget, for some echoes are best left to fade. In the year 1463, in a damp corner of the Low Countries, where canals weaved through the fields like silver threads and mist clung low to the earth, there arose an invention whose purpose, at first glance, seemed entirely noble. It was crafted not by a soldier nor a monk, but by a city clerk, a man who spent his days hunched over ledgers and proclamations, and who believed deeply in the power of the written word. His name was Willem Groen, and he sought not glory nor gold, but order. He lived in a town that had grown too swiftly, where traders clashed with tailors, and law was bent like hot iron by those clever enough to twist it. Records were kept, yes, but they were scattered across parchment, bound in crumbling tomes, guarded by scribes who argued over every ink blot. Deeds were lost, births forgotten, crimes erased not by pardon, but by poor handwriting. So Willem, quiet, pale, and methodical, conceived a tool to correct this, a device that would hold truth, permanent, unbiased, and absolute. He called it the Archivum Mechanica. This mechanical archive was a tall cabinet of dark alder wood, reinforced with brass hinges and crowned with a gearwork dome. Within its chest were slotted dozens of fine wooden plates, each fitted with sliding arms and narrow inked bands. At its heart sat a cylinder made of thick vellum stretched over iron, upon which a single stylus, guided by a system of cogs and pulleys, could inscribe words in perfect lines, dictated by a system of coded levers. Willem designed it to accept tokens, small medallions engraved with a person's name, title, or accusation. When a token was inserted into the archive's mouth, it would trigger the gears, open a plate, and mark a record. No ink-stained clerk, no human hand, only the turn of wheels, the hum of truth being captured without judgment or pause. The Archivum Mechanica would write the world into order. The town council, amused and intrigued, allowed Willem to demonstrate. He inserted the token for a known thief, Barent the Weaver, and the device shuddered into motion. The gears turned, the stylus danced, and on the exposed vellum appeared Barrent of Alley B, twice caught, once pardoned, guilty by pattern, watch advised. The words shocked the room. Not only had it recorded the known facts, it had interpreted them. It had spoken, not just of what was, but what ought to be. Willem beamed. It draws from the master records, he explained, cross-referenced and weighted. It understands implication. It preserves memory. The council, torn between awe and unease, agreed to trial it for a month. Soon, tokens were submitted for every manner of citizen. Merchants, midwives, priests, even children. And always the archivum replied, coolly, precisely, without malice but without mercy. Mechthild, widow, age 47, prone to complaints, has spoken against tithe, dissent probable. Anselm, novice, late to prayers thrice, observed speaking with outsiders, temptation risk. Carol, Cooper's son, keen memory, sharp tongue, future influence possible, monitor closely. The device's judgments were never cruel in wording, but they were absolute in tone, as if spoken not by a person but by something beyond caring. The town, little by little, changed. People grew quieter. They measured their words. Children stopped playing in the streets. Citizens avoided council halls. And the tokens multiplied, hundreds, then thousands, fed into the archivum slot until the cabinet moaned beneath the weight of knowing. But the machine did not forget. One morning, the mayor himself received a summons. His token, long submitted in jest, had been returned by the device with a simple note. This Van Azuren. 2 discrepancies in tax records. Influence high. Corruption likely. Recommend removal. He was gone by dusk. Willem, now celebrated as the recorder, was given his own hall. He expanded the device, added more plates, more cylinders. But something in him faltered. He no longer smiled. He no longer spoke to others without checking their names against his ledgers. One night, a boy crept into the archive room, seeking to learn what the archivum would say of his future. He fed in his token. The machine turned. The stylus scratched. The boy read, Aelric, son of no rank, curious, disobedient, dangerous in time. He fled, and the next morning he was taken to the monastery for guidance. The town grew stiller, as if waiting to be written upon. People ceased to live. They recorded themselves. Every word, every gesture was weighed not by conscience, but by the imagined whisper of the archivum's stylus. It was not until the gears began to stutter, the brass warped by endless motion, that the device began to fail. The last record it wrote was on a stormy night, when lightning struck the dome and froze the cogs in place. On the vellum sheet, scorched and trembling, was a final entry. Willem, recorder, too much written, nothing lived, end inevitable. The cabinet smoldered. Willem was found beside it, eyes wide open, mouth full of soot. He had tried to feed his own token one last time. The Archivum Mechanica was dismantled in silence. The plates burned, the brass sold to a smith. But the vellum, the writing, it was buried beneath the city hall in a box of ash and iron. The machine had meant to preserve truth, but in doing so, it devoured mercy. It wrote away the possibility of change, of growth, of forgiveness. It turned life into a ledger and people into footnotes. And so let tonight be unwritten. Let there be no record, no measure, no name fixed in ink, only breath, slow and soft. Let the gears stop turning. Let sleep be your silence, your forgetting, your peace. In the autumn of 1475, as the last gold leaves clung to the branches and the wind carried with it the scent of smoke and damp hay, there arrived in the border town of Kesselbrook a man whose footsteps left no imprint on the dirt. His name was only half remembered. Nicholas, some said. Others swore it was an alias. But all agreed on one thing. He carried with him a machine unlike anything the town had seen. It was small, delicate, carved from ebony wood and inlaid with slivers of polished amber that shimmered in the light like frozen honey. At its center sat a globe of crystal, cloudy and whorled, mounted on a brass armature that spun ever so slowly, even when untouched. He called it the morning clock. Nicholas claimed it did not tell the hour, nor measure time in any way familiar. This clock, he said softly, does not track the sun. It tracks the sorrow of man. At first, the villagers scoffed. What use was a clock that did not strike the hour? That had no dial, no bell, no hands to chase the minutes like hounds after a stag? But the clock was not silent. When left alone in a room, particularly a room that had known grief, it would begin to turn, slowly, steadily. The globe inside would spin, the amber would pulse faintly, and a sound like distant weeping would hum within the wood. At first, they thought it a trick. Nicholas allowed the curious to inspect it. The device had no hidden compartments, no winding mechanism. It was not powered by spring or weight. Yet always, in the presence of sadness, especially unspoken sadness, it turned. When brought into the home of a widow whose husband had vanished on pilgrimage, the globe spun for hours. When left in the schoolhouse, where a boy had died the year before of fever, it trembled like a heartbeat. Nicholas explained that the clock measured what he called residual ache, a kind of spiritual condensation left behind by human suffering. The more repressed the sorrow, the more powerfully the morning clock responded. Pain buried, he whispered, is still pain. It sings, even in silence. The town changed. Soon the clock was requested at births, in case grief from past generations lingered in the walls. It was placed in churches, and if it stirred during Mass, confessions grew longer. A woman postponed her wedding after the clock spun in her family home. She feared it foretold a sorrow yet to come. And the clock, it seemed, knew things people had forgotten. In the home of a merchant, it spun wildly near an old chest. Inside were letters from a daughter lost at sea decades before, never spoken of again. In the mayor's study, it spun beside a mirror that had once belonged to his mother, who had died mad. People grew afraid. Grief, once a private thing, became a public tremor. Children were told not to cry in the same room as the clock. Lovers hesitated before speaking harsh words, lest the clock catch them in sorrow's earliest echo. The town began to live around the morning clock, as though it were not an object, but a witness. Then came the night it stopped. It was kept, at the time, in the chapel, nestled within a niche near the altar. But on the first frost of winter, after the burial of a young woman who had died in childbirth, the clock ceased its motion. The globe froze in place. The amber grew dim. Nicholas, pale and fevered, examined it. "It is full," he murmured. "It cannot take more." He asked that the clock be moved to the forest outside town. There, he said, the sorrow could seep into the roots, be absorbed by the trees. Return to the earth. The council refused. They locked it in the cellar of the mayor's house, deep in stone and dark. For days, nothing happened. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cellar changed. Walls grew damp, though no moisture came. Shadows stretched longer. Visitors complained of unease, of hearing faint sobs when no one else was near. The mayor fell ill. His sleep grew restless. His dreams, he said, were filled with rooms he'd never entered, but which remembered him all the same. And the clock, unseen, began to turn again. This time not slowly, but with urgency. One morning, the mayor was found in the square, barefoot, eyes wide with fear, murmuring, it remembers everything." Nicholas had vanished. His room at the inn was undisturbed, his belongings neatly folded. The only sign of his passing was a note, pinned to the window. "You cannot measure sorrow without feeding it." The morning clock was buried at last, deep beneath the chapel floor. A slab of iron was set above it, inscribed only with a cross and a date. And though it has not been seen since, some say the chapel floor grows cold in winter, even when fires burn high, that infants cry more easily there, that the choir's hymns on occasion echo strangely. The morning clock was an invention meant to honor grief, to give form to the intangible ache of memory. But in doing so, it made sorrow endless. It stirred what was settled, called out what was buried. It turned mourning into ritual. And worst of all, it made sadness measurable, and therefore endless. Tonight, let your sorrows sleep. Do not measure them. Do not name them. Let them drift like mist beyond the reach of ticking hands. Let no clock mark this hour. Let only silence hold you gently and without judgment, reading in a slow, gentle, and sleep-inducing storyteller voice with a calm medieval ambiance. In a small fortified town nestled between the marshlands of Aquitaine and the crumbling remains of an old Roman road, there once lived a man who could not abide uncertainty. His name was Jean de Claret, a physician by training and a philosopher by temperament. He believed, most devoutly, that all things could be diagnosed, if not cured, that even the most wayward instincts of man, jealousy, rage, betrayal, were simply conditions of the mind, ailments of the soul that could, with the right tools, be measured, labeled, and restrained. It was this belief that led him to create what he called the compass of the will. At a glance, it resembled a navigational instrument, a flat disc, no larger than a bread plate, with a delicate iron needle suspended at its center. Around the edge were inscribed not directions, but virtues and vices: courage, cowardice, pride, mercy, deceit, loyalty, envy, and many others, arranged in a symmetrical ring like the petals of a celestial flower. The compass was meant to point not north, but inward. Jean claimed it could detect the strongest current within a person's will, what they would choose if left to their truest self. By holding the compass in both hands, resting it against the heart, and breathing deeply, one's dominant inner inclination would be revealed. The needle, he said, would quiver, then settle, not by magic nor by divination, but by natural law, drawn by the subtle heat and rhythm of the human spirit. He first tested it on himself. The needle pointed to diligence. He was satisfied. He then brought it to the town's abbess, a kindly woman of great charity. It pointed to justice. To a woodsman who had once confessed to theft, it pointed to desperation. And to a scowling mercenary who laughed as the needle spun madly before resting on wrath. Word spread quickly. Soon, people were lining up at Jean's door, desperate not just to be seen, but to know themselves. The compass promised something no priest, no poem, no confession ever could: certainty. Young lovers came, each fearing that their partner harbored unspoken doubts. A woman wept when her suitor's needle landed on ambition rather than love. A baker, fearing dishonor, had his apprentices tested before entrusting them with his ledgers. Even children were brought forth, held by trembling mothers as the needle flicked toward pride or submission. Jean kept meticulous records. He drew elaborate diagrams, assigning traits to planetary alignments and temperaments. He believed, over time, he could map the moral geography of the soul. But there were complications. One day, a boy of no more than 10 sat before the compass. He was small, bright-eyed, and gentle in manner, yet the needle spun once, twice, and settled on cruelty. The room fell silent. Jean recalibrated the device, cleaned the hinge, tried again. Cruelty. The boy began to cry. Within a week, the boy had been sent to live with relatives far away. For his own safety, they said, but the townsfolk had already begun to whisper, and then came the case of a widow named Aliane. She had been beloved in the town, generous, tender, always present at the sickbed or the grave. Her hands had bathed the dead, fed the hungry, and stitched clothes for orphans. When she placed her fingers on the compass, it quivered and pointed to deceit. There was uproar. Jean insisted the result was not condemnation, merely reflection. "We all possess shadows," he said. "This only reveals which shadow is longest." But the people no longer listened. They began to fear the compass, even as they continued to consult it. They locked away sons whose needles pointed to rebellion. They shunned neighbors marked by lust or greed. They whispered about a man whose needle had settled between nothing and nothing, resting still in a place that bore no label. Jean, once praised as a visionary, found himself doubted. He grew gaunt. He refused to leave his chamber. He built more compasses, smaller, larger, with finer needles and new inscriptions. He tested himself daily. At first, the needle remained loyal to diligence. But then, one morning, it flickered toward doubt, then obsession, then despair. On the last day of autumn, Jean vanished. His house was found empty. Upon his writing desk was a final compass, unfinished, its face inscribed with only one word: silence. No one ever saw him again. Years later, the original compass of the will was sealed within the cathedral archives. But there are rumors, soft, unwelcome, that it still turns, even untouched, reacting to those who pass too near. One monk claimed he heard a faint hum, like breath held too long. Another, when reaching for a hymn book, found the compass pointed directly at him, to cowardice. The compass of the will was meant to illuminate, to bring clarity to the murky tides of human nature. But what it revealed was this: we are not meant to know ourselves so completely. Certainty can strip away hope. Identity, once fixed, becomes a cage. And even the gentlest soul, if told often enough what it is, may one day become it. Let the compass sleep. Let your direction be uncharted, your soul unmeasured. Rest now and drift. No needle can find you here. Reading in a slow, gentle, and sleep-inducing storyteller voice with a calm medieval, the acoustic vigil helm emerged in the late 13th century during a time of great unrest and whispering paranoia among the landed nobility. Castles no longer felt like sanctuaries. They had become places of secrets, schemes, and silent footfalls echoing in long, torch-lit corridors. Rumors of betrayal were common, and with each hushed conversation behind closed doors, The desire to hear what was hidden grew ever more desperate. It was in this climate of distrust and anxious stillness that the helm came into being. The invention itself was a monstrous curiosity. Fashioned from a standard iron helm, but heavily modified, the device featured 3 large horn-like funnels protruding from its surface, one directed forward and the other 2 angled behind the ears, all designed to gather sound from multiple directions. These horns were constructed from layered copper and iron, intended to serve as auditory amplifiers. Within the helmet's thick casing, a series of copper tubes and resonant chambers channeled the incoming sound toward the ears. Its designers were not mere blacksmiths, but monastic engineers, learned monks who had studied echoes in cloisters and the way psalms carried through cathedral domes. They believed that if sound could be gathered and focused through sacred architecture, it might likewise be shaped by man-made instruments. Thus, the acoustic vigil helm was meant to gift the wearer with superior hearing, capable of detecting treachery through stone walls or the rustling of a cloak in a moonlit corridor. But though its premise was rooted in curiosity and caution, its execution was lamentable. When worn, the helmet quickly overwhelmed the senses. Every sound, no matter how small or distant, was magnified into a deafening confusion. The gentle breeze became a howling gale. The creak of a floorboard thundered like a falling tree, voices distorted as they echoed through the copper coils, emerging with strange warbles and pitches, like distant bells heard underwater. Rather than sharpening one's vigilance, the helm muddled the mind. Reports from the period describe men becoming physically ill after wearing it for mere minutes. One exhausted retainer in Norfolk, assigned to keep watch over his lord's chamber while wearing the helm, collapsed against the wall and began to weep, unable to tell where the sounds were coming from. Another tale speaks of a young page in Gascony who attempted to wear the helm during a night shift. The following morning, he had to be treated for bleeding in the ears and disorientation so severe that he mistook the chirping of sparrows for a battle cry. More than its auditory failure, the physical bulk of the helmet proved burdensome. The horns protruded so far from the sides and top that movement indoors became a clumsy trial. Doors had to be passed through sideways, lest one be wedged fast between the frame. Hallways were treacherous, and even turning one's head brought the danger of unbalancing or colliding with furniture. The very shape that was meant to enhance awareness rendered the wearer as fragile and unstable as a puppet with loose strings. There was no grace in its form, no artistry in its use, yet its symbolic appeal lingered. To certain lords and barons, it represented ultimate vigilance, an instrument that would prevent deceit before it could flower. Some commissioned ornate versions of the helm, adorned with painted sigils or engraved prayers for divine clarity. Others insisted their servants wear it in rotation through the night, convinced that it would prevent assassination or rebellion. But the truth of the matter was clear to all who tried it. The acoustic vigil helm was a failure. Not only did it fail to achieve its goal, it actively worked against it. Far from improving awareness, it rendered the wearer incapacitated, detached from their surroundings by a swirling chaos of sound. Its presence became the subject of ridicule. Jesters mimicked it by strapping cooking pots to their heads and pretending to fall over in the hallways. Even the monks who had conceived the idea grew disenchanted. Their writings, preserved in fragmentary margins of illuminated manuscripts, gradually shifted from awe to apology. One anonymous brother recorded, in Latin, a bitter epitaph for the helm: Aurum audit, sed mentem perdit. It hears gold, but loses the mind. Others referred to it as the crown of confusion, a headpiece better suited to fools than to sentinels. The last recorded use of the acoustic vigil helm was in the early 14th century, when a particularly distrustful count in northern France insisted on wearing it during his nightly walks through his own fortress. The tale goes that he tripped down a narrow staircase, unable to hear the shouts of his guards over the reverberations of his own footsteps. He survived with a broken leg and bruised pride, and the helm was locked away, never to be used again. What remains of the vigil helm now lies in quiet obscurity, tucked in the storage room of a minor museum near the coast of Brittany. Dust settles upon its rusting horns, and the hollow tubes no longer carry sound. But if one were to stand very still beside it in the hush of the archive room, and listen carefully. One might imagine the faint echoes of a time when paranoia birthed absurdity, and a helmet meant to guard the truth instead drowned it in noise. As we move gently onward in our tale, we leave behind the dissonant murmurs of metal and madness. The next invention in our long, meandering path through history is not one of sound, but of warmth, a device intended to soothe the body, though it, too, would bring only discomfort and complication. Let us walk there slowly, as the rain continues to fall and the night deepens around us. The wind whispered gently through the bare limbs of the orchard trees, and beyond them, a hearth's glow flickered quietly in a modest stone cottage. All around, the stillness of the hour clung close, soft like a woolen blanket. It is in this comforted hush that we step into the penultimate chamber of our long, wandering tale. A story not of armor or battle, not of hearing or seeing, but of something far more elemental: warmth. Tonight, we open the chapter of the portable warmth cowl, a curious contrivance born in the colder reaches of northern Europe, sometime in the early 14th century. It was an age when castles were built more for defense than for comfort, and winters settled over the land like a heavy gray veil. Cold was not merely inconvenient, it was a creeping, bone-deep torment that stole away sleep, productivity, and sometimes life itself. Fires could only do so much in vast stone chambers, and thick furs were expensive and not always enough. In this bitter context, the portable warmth cowl came into being. Its creator, a minor nobleman with a penchant for invention named Lord Aelric of Eldham, was no stranger to discomfort. By all accounts, his keep was drafty, his joints ached with the cold, and he was known to mutter grievances about the damp settling into his bones. But unlike others, Lord Aelric took action. He commissioned his smiths and herbalists to collaborate on a wearable solution: a heated garment that could be worn around the shoulders and neck, close to the vital passages of blood, preserving warmth through the harshest nights. The first version of the cowl was a heavy mantle sewn from tightly packed wool and sheep's fleece, but sewn into its lining were small clay pouches, each designed to contain heated stones taken directly from the fireplace and inserted into the garment just before use. A system of flaps and ties kept the stones in place, and a drawstring at the collar was intended to trap the heat close to the chest and throat. At first glance, the idea was sound, and when used cautiously for very short periods, it did provide a pocket of warmth in an otherwise freezing hall. But the problems, as one might imagine, began to surface almost immediately. For one, the heat from the stones, when freshly drawn from fire, was far too intense. Several of Lord Aelric's pages suffered burns from improperly cooled pouches. One lad, attempting to wear the cowl during evening prayers, fainted as the heat singed his skin and the wool began to smolder. In another incident, the cowl was worn beneath a heavy cloak during a nighttime patrol of the manor grounds, and the trapped heat caused the wearer to become dizzy and collapse into a snowdrift. Lord Aelric refused to accept defeat. He saw in the complaints not failure, but opportunity. He ordered that the cowl be revised. The second iteration involved replacing the stone pouches with small iron plates, heated on a brazier, and inserted into reinforced pockets. To moderate the heat, thin layers of soaked linen were wrapped around each plate, though this only delayed the inevitable. Once again, users reported burns, dizziness, and in one infamous case, a minor fire when the iron heated the inner wool to the point of combustion. Servants began to refer to it, behind closed doors, as Aelric's oven hood. The very idea of putting hot metal so near one's neck quickly turned from innovation to farce. Still, others took notice. The nobility across the region, forever curious and ever eager to outdo one another in both luxury and eccentricity, attempted their own versions of the warmth cowl. Some added herbal pouches meant to release calming scents when heated, though these often caused sneezing fits or allergic rashes. Others stitched thin tubes through the lining, through which steam was meant to circulate, only to discover that the pressure burst the tubes and scalded the wearer. A particularly ambitious attempt came from a guild of tailors in Ghent, who endeavored to create a cowl lined with small brass flasks filled with warmed oil. The theory was elegant. Oil, once warmed, would retain heat longer than stone or metal. But theory and practice do not always walk side by side. The oil often leaked or was too hot, and more than one noblewoman found her silk underdress ruined by oil stains and scorched lining. By the time Lord Aelric passed away, some say from a chill he never could quite banish, the idea had already begun to fade into ridicule. No lasting comfort had been found, and yet fragments of the cowl's legacy remain. In the British Museum, tucked within a case of odd garments from bygone eras, rests one of the last known cowls, heavy, patched with soot marks, and stitched with loving care. A small plaque beneath it reads, "An early attempt at portable heat, bold but deeply flawed." What the cowl teaches us, in the quiet light of reflection, is something not altogether unkind. In the face of discomfort, mankind reaches not only for shelter, but for invention. We are never content to suffer silently. We try, however clumsily, to tame the world around us. And while we may laugh gently at the sight of Osric's heated neckpiece, there is something admirable in his effort, not in its result, but in the yearning behind it. As the night draws further on and the last coals of the hearth settle into a low glow, we turn now to the final chapter of our long and peculiar journey. There remains one last invention to speak of, one that, though perhaps less dangerous than those before, reveals a different side of medieval misjudgment. A creation not of heat or steel, but of taste. A culinary invention that failed so spectacularly it became legend. Let us walk there, slowly, through the dark corridors of memory, into the kitchens of long-forgotten halls. In the stillness of the small hours, when even the owls have grown weary and the stars begin to fade behind a veil of mist, we come, at last, to the closing chamber of our quiet procession through medieval missteps. Our path now winds not through armories or towers, but into the heart of every manor, every keep, every lowly peasant hut and lordly banquet hall, the kitchen. And it is here, amid the steam, the hearth, and the scent of roast and broth, that we find perhaps the most curious, most benignly absurd invention of them all, the meatless mock boar. It was the twilight of the 14th century. Europe had already been reshaped by plague, famine, and war, and yet, in the quieter corners of society, culinary experimentation began to take strange and whimsical turns. Among the wealthy, food had long since become more than nourishment. It was spectacle, symbolism, a means of displaying one's refinement and dominion over nature. Dishes were crafted to astonish the eye as much as the tongue, and none stood prouder than the roasted boar's head, the centerpiece of many a noble feast, its jaw agape, often crowned with fruit or gilded leaves. Yet, in certain ecclesiastical households and monastic communities, where strict dietary rules forbade the consumption of meat on many days, this indulgence presented a dilemma. How, they wondered, could one observe abstinence yet still evoke the grandeur of a feast? How could one fast and still feast? And so, the meatless mock boar was born. At its core, the dish was an elaborate illusion, a vegetarian facsimile designed to look precisely like the head of a wild boar. It was crafted from a curious amalgam of ingredients: ground almonds, breadcrumbs, crushed chestnuts, figs, and honey. These were mashed and molded into a stiff, pliable paste known as marchpane, often used in sweetmeats and desserts. But in the case of the mock boar, it was pressed into intricate molds to replicate the contours of a boar's snout, tusks, and jawline. Dried plum pits were inserted to mimic eyes, and beet juice or soot was used to darken the surface, giving the illusion of roasted flesh. The results were unsettling. By all accounts, the appearance was striking. The monks at Abingdon Abbey, who were among the first to attempt the feat, wrote of their surprising success in deceiving the visiting archdeacon. The poor man, it is said, blessed the dish before carving into it, only to discover the soft, nutty pulp beneath the convincing exterior. Politeness demanded he take a bite, and thus the tragedy of the mock boar deepened. For though it looked the part, the taste was far from pleasing. The dense mixture was overly sweet and oddly textured, neither firm like meat nor smooth like pudding. The use of garlic or vinegar to offset the sweetness only led to further confusion of the palate. One chronicler wrote, "It offends neither the tongue nor the belly, but it pleases neither, and leaves the soul disquieted." Still, the idea spread. Cooks across the continent tried their hand at improving the recipe. Some added lentils or mashed beans to give the paste more bite. Others tried wrapping the mock head in cabbage leaves before baking to simulate skin. A group of especially ambitious friars in Burgundy even attempted a fully sculpted mock beast, complete with limbs and tail, which promptly collapsed under its own weight during procession. It wasn't just the flavor that drew criticism. The theological community, ever watchful, began to question the ethics of such culinary trickery. Was it in keeping with the spirit of fasting to make food that only mimicked forbidden delights? Was deception, even if gastronomic, appropriate in holy observance? A fiery sermon from a Dominican preacher in Liège declared the mock boar a beast of false virtue, accusing it of tempting the devout with illusions of carnality. As quickly as it rose, the mock boar faded. It lingered in a few cookbooks, often as a curiosity, a lark to amuse guests during meatless days, but never became a staple. Its memory lives on in marginal illustrations and the occasional monkish joke, where almond paste and false tusks symbolized both piety and folly. And yet, in this final chapter, there is something tender. For all its silliness, the meatless mock boar was not a tool of war or a cruel miscalculation. It was, instead, a gentle rebellion against hardship. It was a gesture of playfulness within restriction, of beauty attempted amid absence. In trying to conjure the form of joy when the substance was denied, the medieval cook was no fool, but an artist working with humble clay. So as the fire dwindles and the shadows lengthen in the corners of the hall, we draw the tapestry of our tale to a close. We have wandered through misfired arrows, through blistering helms and choking perfumes, through beds of stone and cloaks that cook their wearers. And now we end in a kitchen, beside a crumbling mockery of a feast, which, despite all its faults, reminds us that even the worst inventions come from a place of deeply human longing. Longing to be safe, to be warm, to be joyful, to make sense of the world. And in that, perhaps, they were not such failures after all. Good night.